are susceptible to diabetes, glaucoma, and lower IQs. June has the highest levels of Nobel Prize winners and are likely to have poor eyesight. July are most optimistic, likely to be short-sighted, susceptible to tumors and rheumatism. August are likely to struggle in school and have arthritis. September are the highest achievers in school because they are the oldest in the grade, susceptible to thyroid problems and osteoporosis. October lives the longest, on average 6 months longer than spring babies. However, you also develop the most diseases. November has the highest number of serial killers. You're susceptible to skin issues and heart conditions. December may have allergies or asthma due to being born in peak flu season, also susceptible to depression. Scientists believe these findings could be due to changes in UV rays, vitamin D levels, viruses, and fetal development. But the differences between months are small, and there are so many other factors involved, so don't take it too seriously. A study in 1961 measured people's obedience to authority figures. Participants were ordered to administer multiple electric shocks, increasing in voltage to a person in another room, while being able to hear them screaming and pleading to stop. Although these were actors not actually being shocked, the participants didn't know that. After a while, the actor would stop responding completely, as if they had passed out or died. The participants were not threatened or yelled at. They were simply instructed, a maximum of 4 times if needed, to keep administering the shocks. The results show that 65% of participants administered the final and seemingly fatal 450-volt electric shock to the person in the next room. Chimeras exist, and we're not talking about the mythical creature. A chimera is a single organism that is made up of cells from 2 or more individuals, so it contains 2 sets of DNA. This could cause, for example, the chimera to have 2 different blood types, 2 different skin types, or genitals that have both male and female parts. One way a human chimera can form is when a twin fetus dies in the womb, and their cells are absorbed by the remaining fetus. In one case, a man who didn't know he was a chimera had a baby and failed the paternity test. The baby had received the DNA of the man's twin, whose cells he had absorbed. So technically, this baby's father had never even been born. Sitting down for long periods of time has shown to cause a shorter lifespan, increased risk of heart disease, diabetes, dementia, weakened bones, and much more. A 13-year study followed 70,000 women, concluding those who sat for over 6 hours a day were 94% more likely to die than those who sat for less than 3 hours. Even if you work out 7 hours a week, you can't reverse the effects of sitting for 7 hours at a time. The effects are so serious that medical experts started referring to it as the sitting disease. The average American sits for 11 hours every day. A stuttering experiment was conducted on 22 orphan children receive negative speech therapy and were belittled for every speech imperfection. Normal-speaking children in the second group developed speech problems, which they then retained for the rest of their lives. In the future, if you find yourself needing a new heart or a new kidney, you may be given a pig's organ. Experiments in 2021 of 2 genetically modified pig kidneys were successfully transplanted into a brain-dead human recipient. This is called xenotransplantation. On January 7th, 2022, for the first time ever, doctors in Maryland successfully transplanted a modified pig's heart into a living man. There's a theory in physics known as quantum entanglement. When 2 particles come into contact, they create an entangled relationship. If you then move them far apart, even thousands of miles away from each other, the connection is still there. If you spin one of those particles, the other one will instantly start spinning too, as if the two are connected by a mysterious communications channel. Einstein called it spooky action at a distance, and it has been proven in countless tests. MKUltra was a project conducted by the CIA to develop mind control techniques that can be used against enemies during war. Their main goal was to remain ahead in mind control technology for use in interrogations, torture, or to weaken the individual and force confessions. But the scope widened, eventually resulting into illegal drug testing on thousands of unknowing Americans. The agency tried to alter brain functions and manipulate mental states of the people, using drugs like LSD and other chemicals, along with other forms of psychological torture. They also ran a series of projects in an attempt to answer the question, can we get control of an individual to the point where he will do our bidding against his will, and even against fundamental laws of nature? One of these programs, Project Artichoke, studied hypnosis, forced morphine addictions, drug withdrawal, and the use of chemicals to incite amnesia in unknowing human subjects. The sand flea is a parasite that burrows permanently into the skin of a warm-blooded host, like a human, where it swells, defecates, and produces eggs, before dying 4 to 6 weeks later, still embedded in the skin. Some people can be infested with dozens, as the fleas attract one another. A researcher in Madagascar, who was so interested in the sand flea's development that she let one live inside her foot for 2 months. She figured out that the parasites most likely have sex when the female is already inside the host. The element polonium is a rare radioactive metalloid that occurs naturally. It's 250,000 times more toxic than cyanide. 1 gram, if ingested or injected, could kill 10 million people. Former spy Alexander Litvinenko was poisoned with a trace of polonium in his tea. Doctors had trouble diagnosing him because, as a poison, it had never been documented before, and it was probably the first time anyone had been tested for the presence of it in their body. It took 23 days for him to die. Vladimir Demikov was a successful surgeon, and his studies helped medical science to advance. But in one of his more disturbing experiments, he stitched the head, shoulders, and front legs of a puppy onto the neck of a German shepherd. The surgery was a success, as both dogs could move around independent of each other, but they didn't survive very long due to tissue rejection. He created 20 of these 2-headed dogs, but none survived more than a month. Radio frequency identification chips have coming soon, prisons, hospitals, and companies could use the chips to track people's locations, medical histories, and to grant or deny access to rooms and documents. Many state correctional facilities are already using the technology for ankle bracelets. In 1956 and 57, the US Army conducted a number of biological warfare experiments on the cities of Savannah, Georgia, and Avon Park, Florida. In one experiment, millions of infected mosquitoes were released into the two cities in order to see if the insects could spread yellow fever and dengue fever. Not surprisingly, hundreds contracted illnesses, including fevers, respiratory problems, stillbirths, encephalitis, and typhoid. You might think you are solid flesh and bone, but most of you is actually empty space, because the gaps between atoms is so large. And this is true for every physical thing, as all things are made of atoms. The pure matter that makes up the entire human race could fit into the mass of a sugar cube. Twilight anesthesia is a type of anesthesia that doesn't numb the pain, but instead makes you forget, using certain sedatives and hypnotics to stop the brain forming new memories. During the procedure, you are conscious, but in a drowsy state. It's used for minor surgeries, when general anesthesia is not necessary. Similarly, twilight sleep was a drug used on women to help them give birth up until the 1970s, invented by Dr. Gauss, who advertised it as a painless way to give birth. When the patients first began to experience labor pains, they'd be given morphine and scopolamine. While this would prevent them from remembering the pain, it did not prevent them from feeling it. He was well aware of this, given that he was forced to restrain women to the beds, using straitjackets or straps on the arms and legs, bandaging their eyes and inserting cotton into their ears to stop them injuring themselves and others by thrashing around and screaming. In relation to this, but even worse, newborn babies are often not given any anesthesia during painful procedures. In 2014, a review of neonatal pain management in Europe found that newborn babies experience 11 painful procedures each day on average, but 60% of these babies were not receiving any kind of pain relief. These procedures ranged in scope from the very mild, such as taking blood samples, to more invasive interventions like chest tube insertions and circumcisions. There is a misconception in the medical community that babies don't feel pain like adults. The latest evidence shows, however, that newborns not only experience pain, but that they experience it even more intensely than adults. In 1955, Henrietta Lacks was a poor, uneducated African-American woman from Baltimore, and she had cervical cancer. Doctors took samples of her cancerous cells while diagnosing her. They gave some of that tissue to a researcher without Henrietta's knowledge or consent. Henrietta's cells, now known as HeLa cells, were exceptional and are basically immortal. Scientists had never been able to keep these cells alive or clone them before. Today they are still used and have been involved in many key discoveries for cancer, polio, AIDS, and even COVID-19 vaccines. Henrietta died penniless and was buried without a tombstone in a family cemetery. For decades, her husband and 5 children had no idea about Henrietta's contribution to modern medicine. A Japanese biological warfare project named Unit 731 conducted horrific human experiments. Thousands of enemy soldiers and civilians were used as guinea pigs, deliberately infected with the plague, cholera, and other diseases. No test subject came out alive. Some experiments included vivisection without outside and tied to stakes. They would then test new biological weapons such as plague cultures or bombs filled with plague-infested fleas on them. Some were poisoned to develop a more potent poison gas. The aim was to create biological weapons and was supported by Japanese medical schools, doctors and researchers. The operation was kept a secret for over 40 years until they admitted to it in 1984. An anonymous medical assistant described his first vivisection in an interview. The fellow knew that it was over for him, and so he didn't struggle when they led him into the room and tied him down. But when I picked up the scalpel, that's when he began screaming. I cut him open from the chest to the stomach, and he screamed terribly, and his face was all twisted in agony. He made this unimaginable sound. He was screaming so horribly. But then he finally stopped. This was all in a day's work for the surgeons, but it really left an impression on me because it was my first time. North Korea seems to have a similar idea, except their experiments are still happening today. In one test, 50 healthy women prisoners were given poisoned cabbage leaves. All 50 were dead within 20 minutes. Other experiments included surgery without anesthesia, purposeful starvation, beating prisoners over the head before using them as target practice, and chambers in which whole families are murdered with suffocation gas. It is said that each month a black van known as the Crow collects 40 to 50 people from a camp and takes them to an unknown location for the experiments. Helium makes up 24% of our universe, but is not renewable. It is used in many industries on Earth, and we are running out because it keeps escaping the atmosphere. It's estimated the planet will completely run out of helium by 2050. 600 African American men in Macon County, Alabama, were enrolled in an experiment where they were promised free medical care to treat their syphilis. However, researchers had no intention of treating them and persuaded doctors to give them placebos. They wanted to see the full progression of the disease, with the goal of tracking all the participants until they had died. This resulted in the men going blind, insane, causing brain damage, paralysis, and more. A reporter found out about it and broke the story, causing public outrage. The experiment was then shut down after 40 years. By this time, 128 of the participants had died from the illness. 40 spouses had been diagnosed with it, and it had been passed down to 19 children at birth. Dancing epidemics affected people across Europe in the Middle Ages. Those affected would often be unable to stop dancing until they were so exhausted they died. These events are some of the first known instances of mass hysteria. Another example occurred in 1962, Tanzania. A girl at a boarding school suddenly started laughing and was unable to stop. Her laughing fit quickly produced a laughing epidemic among her schoolmates, which became of such magnitude that the school had to be shut down. Upon sending all of the girls home, the epidemic spread to the community of 1,000 people, and it only began to fade after 2 years. Other symptoms in the village were uncontrollable fits of running, crying, and occasional violence. A more recent mass hysteria incident was in 2012, when teenage girls from the small town of Leroy, New York, started to exhibit symptoms similar to those seen in Tourette syndrome, such as uncontrollable jerks of the limbs shows that social media may play a part in modern cases of mass hysteria. The actual definition of mass hysteria is still debated in the medical community. One suggestion is that it's an epidemic of the mind, leading to symptoms in the body, which is spread via social contact. It is characterized by an outbreak of abnormal illness behavior that cannot be explained by physical disease. The freshwater snail carries parasitic worms that infect people with a disease called schistosomiasis. This can cause intense abdominal pain and blood in the stool or urine. It can happen from drinking water containing their eggs. 20,000 people are killed every year by this little snail, which is more deaths than sharks, lions, and wolves combined. In 1969, during South Africa's apartheid era, thousands of homosexual